today we are focusing on the topic of responsible consumption. So before we start, I wanted to set the stage and talk a little bit about where these pro seminars are coming from and what the BMBW, or Better Marketing for a Better World initiative, is. So this initiative grew out of a special issue at the Journal of Marketing that was published this year. And this special issue was co-edited with Rajesh Chandi at LBS, Chris Momin at Duke, and John Roberts at the University of New South Wales. And the four of us were very excited to see the response to the special issue and the wonderful papers that we received and that were published eventually in the special issue. And it inspired us to think about keeping the momentum going and creating an initiative that would really bring scholars together who were interested in work that would lead to a better world. So when we say better world, what we're really talking about is well aligned with what you might call the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So I think some of these are up on the screen. You can see no poverty, no hunger, good health, and so on. So all of these are kind of the metrics one might use when we think about a better world. And what we want to focus on is what can marketers and what can the field of marketing do to really enable and facilitate a better world. And we think that scholars have a lot that we can contribute to make this happen. And towards that, the BMBW initiative has three specific initiatives. The first one is workshops, conferences, competitions. We're just getting off the ground. We started that by running forums where we had all the authors who published papers in that special issue talk about the papers. And that happened this summer. And we were really very thrilled at the response and at the initial set of forums. And then we moved into doing some training with these pro seminars. The first one, as I mentioned, was on sales management and how to get ideas in that domain. So we are starting with pro seminars on idea generation. We might go into methods later on, but the idea is to really involve the community and to share ideas, share best practices, share methodology, and all of that. And today is actually a good example of that because we are involving some of the leading scholars in this area to really discuss and share their thoughts and ideas with all of us. And the last aspect of our initiative is to create this data repository. And we do have on the bmbw.org website some data sets that you can look at and that you can use in your own research. So that's in a nutshell what this initiative is about. I want to turn it over now to Shilpa Madan, who is co-moderating this pro seminar with me, and she's going to walk us through the responsible consumption topic, as well as what we're going to be doing the rest of this session.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Gita, for setting the context. So today we are going to have this pro seminar on idea generation about responsible consumption. And we are delighted to be joined by Pierre, Laura, and Kate to be our faculty resource persons in helping us think more deeply about what responsible consumption means and what we as consumer researchers can do to encourage consumers to consume or think about their consumption in a deeper, more meaningful way. So what's the plan for today? So there's going to be a quick context, which Gita and I will do in the next couple of minutes. Then we have a lot of inspiration coming your way by the way of our three scholars. And then we will go into breakout rooms where we will discuss research ideas, get some feedback on our thinking, and have a question and answer session with our faculty scholars. So that's the roadmap for today. Before I jump into the next part and hand it over to our faculty resource persons, I wanted to share where the idea for this came from. So Gita and I organized, and some of you might have joined there, an ACR knowledge forum on how to identify the anatomy of a strong socially relevant paper, how to craft a paper that has better marketing for a better world at the heart of what it does. And the number one principle that came out of that conversation that all of our 13 scholars who were part of that knowledge forum mentioned is that the paper must have better marketing for a better world at the heart of it. Like centrality of your idea to creating a better world should be at the heart of the paper and not just an afterthought or not something that's relegated to the general discussion section, saying, oh yes, there are implications for policymakers too. So the idea for this pro seminar is to put responsible consumption at the heart of our idea generation and research process. And for that, we will hear from some of the best people in the field. And first up, we have Pierre Chandon. I don't really need to introduce Pierre, but he's the L'Oreal Chair Professor of Marketing, Innovation, and Creativity at INSEAD. Pierre is the absolute leading authority on consumer health and well-being in our field, and we're delighted to have him with us. He's also written some tremendous best-selling cases, which are taught all over the world in MBA programs, including one on Unilever, which I think is fantastically written, Unilever Brazil Laundry. So with that, happy to welcome Pierre. And Pierre first is going to talk about this paper, which is just out in Journal of Consumer Psychology. And he'll also give us a behind the curtain look on the process of publishing a paper that has better marketing for consumers at the heart of it. Thank you, Pierre. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Shilpa. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Gita. My understanding is there's not a lot of time. I mean, the goal is not to present the paper per se, although I'll do very briefly that, is I think to show an example of a research, which I think, you'll judge, as trying to look at the issues that you were mentioning. And the big issue really is, are we in marketing really contributing to a big and important problem in the world today, which is obesity? And how can we study that problem, maybe outside the traditional tools, outside doing our line on or online studies? And so the goal of the paper is really to see whether people with obesity are more responsive to food marketing. We tested 3 kind of packaging-based tactics that you'll see, and to also look at what can we learn if we put in the same paper a bunch of marketing professors and then some nutritionists and people who actually work with obese people. And so just for the behind the scene, this is the first, and I'm sure the last time I ever had a paper that was conditionally accepted on the first round. It was really amazing. The editors, Priya and Anirban, said, okay, the paper has only 1 study. Not all the hypotheses are actually borne out from the study, and then there's some issues, but we're going to accept it. And we were just totally amazed and happy about it. And on the one hand, it looked like, okay, we have a winning formula. Now, let me tell you the true story, because it was sent in October 2020, accepted in January 2021. But actually, the paper started in 2010 or 2011. I can't even find out exactly. When I went and gave a talk to the nutritionist in the endocrinology department at the hospital in Paris, and that already, I think, says, how come they invited me? It's because for many years, and France is not a really big country, but I've been reaching out to people and presenting in seminars whenever I'm invited. And this is how these things happen. And so I met Karine Clément, who's the head of this institute. And then with Hilke and Jan was a PhD student at INSEAD at the time. And then we involved 3 other people from Pitié-Salpêtrière. And that's why we have all of these logos here. And we have even more projects that started from this, with Hilke being the leader, with even more co-authors. And that means here, this is a paper that took 10 years from start to finish, more or less, okay? Not, of course, full time, but it was extremely, extremely difficult to get this paper. And the basic idea was very simple. We said, okay, these people there are doing already a study. They have all the RRB that's necessary, because, of course, it's a different story when you're doing medical research. They're going to look at the microbiota, the gut intestinal flora of very morbidly obese patients, all women, before and after surgery. And I went and I said, hey, can we go and ask them a few questions and do a few tests? And they said, sure. And so we thought that's going to be easy, right? Turns out it just took 2 years to get the first 25 patients, 6 years in total. And then 2 years to just get the data agreement, because I didn't realize it, but it's a really big deal to be able to share medical data, at least in France, probably the same in most other countries. So we actually went through 13 RAs, like Quentin, that some of you know, who helped us with that. And so, massive efforts, but to have, I think in the end, conditional acceptance, but this is not the path you want to take if you want something fast and easy. But what I think we're trying to do here is we're trying to do something that really bothered me for many, many years. And like everybody else, I started my papers with the first paragraph saying obesity is a big problem. We're going to have implications for obesity. But the truth is, I had never actually studied in any of my studies anyone who is actually obese, because they are not in our undergraduate students. And we have a few overweight people, but people who are really chronically obese, you have to go to the hospital to find them. And so if you look here, the number of papers that mention obesity in green is exploding, but the number of papers that actually survey people with obesity is minuscule. So we wanted to go beyond that. And then we wanted to look at this big question, okay, is it food marketing that's making them at least partly obese? And if that's true, then we would expect that responsiveness to food marketing would contribute to obesity. And so among the obese group, we should be finding more people who are responsive to food marketing than among a group of lean people. So that was the first idea, which is to compare at T0 obese and lean people. And then the second question is, how's surgery, gastric bypass, changing that? Gastric bypass is the only thing that really works against obesity once you're obese. And what was interesting for us was, if it really changes people's responsiveness to food marketing, then it means it's not a direct, simple causal relationship. That responsiveness to food marketing makes you obese. It could be the other way around, that actually it's being obese that changes something, I'm not sure what exactly, maybe in fact in your gut microbiota, that makes you more responsive to the environment in large, as opposed to your internal satiety signals. So these are the goals, and we did three kinds of tasks, and maybe I'll show you two of them. But these are not new tasks. They were all taken from existing research. So there was actually no theoretical really innovation in the paper. So this is a very classic idea, this health halo effect. I'm showing you food that's supposed to be bad, like McNuggets, and food that's supposed to be good. I'm asking you to estimate healthiness in the forms of number of calories, which is really what matters if you're obese. And we choose the food in a way that there's a surprise. So here, for example, the yogurts, people will underestimate the calories. That's the health halo. And then the indulgent food, other people call it a health horn. People think they're really devilish, but they're not so bad. And so we just add this difference between the true calorie and the estimation for both the healthy and indulgent food. And we compare different groups of participants. So we started with 73 obese patients who were scheduled to get surgery. And we compare them with 41 lean controls that have the same socioeconomic background, which is very important because the two are very related. But also we compare them with an obese control group of people who were not scheduled to get surgery, which was also very hard to recruit. And it is important because it could be that those people who decide, they go to the doctor and they decide to get bypass, they're probably different from another sample of people who are already obese and but don't want to go get the surgery. And so what you can see here is that everybody makes these mistakes, okay? But people who are obese, they are more likely to be influenced by the stereotypes of the food as healthy or indulgent in estimating calorie content. So we have 63% here among obese patients versus around 50 for lean controls, and the obese controls are the same. And so you'll see this pattern all the time, which is that people with obesity, they're more likely to fall for our marketing tactics. So that's point number one. Point number two is what happens after surgery. And so the other gray bars here show the result after 6 months and after 1 year. And as you can see, we lost people, obviously, because of attrition. But you can see the trend here is that surgery reduces the responsiveness to marketing factors down to the level of people who are not obese. And it's not just the passage of time that does it, because we also tested the lean control after 6 months and they remain the same. And so this is a pattern we found for three very simple tasks, which we were able to run within subjects. So we had more observations. Another task was just the response to the branding of the sizes. That was inspired by a paper by Edinoglu and Radha Krishna, which we basically show the same three portions of fries, but we either call them mini, small, medium, or small, medium, large, or medium, large, extra large. And as you know, these names, you can call them whatever you want. And we wanted to see whether people would really focus on the branding, on the name. And for example, if they do, then they will be less likely to choose the small portion if it's called mini, as opposed to medium, right? Because mini is not enough. And what we looked at, the DV, is the change in the number of calories ordered. It's hypothetical, by the way, but between the different conditions. So it's within subjects again. And here again, we see the same result. The obese group, they were more likely to be influenced by the naming, by the branding, than the lean controls. And over time, though, there was really a surprisingly big effect. Right after the surgery, they actually were totally irresponsive now to food marketing. And so again, what you can see here is that in a way, the relationship, at least it goes in one direction. Getting gastric bypass does a lot of things to your psychology and to your body. It changes the intestinal flora. We don't know why, but what we can clearly see is that it really changes the responsiveness to food marketing. And it's not just the passage of time, because again, among the lean control, there's no effect. There's a third one here. It was adapted from the paper that I actually presented at ACR, because I really love it, by Catherine Sharp, Uber and Stilin, which looks at the effect of the range of sizes. Okay, if you have small, medium, large that are 3 large cups or 3 small cups, and we looked at inconsistent choices, again, within subjects. If people have a true preference for 47 centiliter, they should choose it no matter what. But what happens is people have extremeness aversion, and so they're going to upsize in this context and downsize there. And we just basically counted whether there were inconsistent choices. So here the effects were a bit less strong, and so at T0, you still see the same pattern, but it was not statistically significant. But we did still see the decrease after gastric bypass. And so final conclusions, yes, people with obesity, they are more likely to be influenced by these 3 tactics. And that means that perhaps that's the reason why they're obese in the first place. Now, people who have a higher responsiveness to marketing tactics, because all the tactics that we showed, what they do is essentially they frame as healthier than they really are some food. And if you fall for it, you will buy the foods that you think are healthy when they're not, or you'll be choosing a bigger portion than you realize. But what's really interesting is that the fact that weight loss due to surgery reduces the bias means this is not a personality trait. It's not because of impulsivity or other individual characters, which should be the same before and after surgery. So our theory right now is that it's kind of a 2 levels, okay? First, it could be that some people are more exposed, but maybe equally responsive to food marketing. And as a result, they're likely to gain weight. And then it's the fact that they have this higher weight that increases their responsiveness to food marketing. It's not the other way around. And why? Because again, if they lose weight, then they're able to better choose based on their true preferences, as opposed to what marketers are doing. And so the big question, of course, is we don't know what exactly is responsible. It could be the surgery in and of itself, a kind of a huge placebo effect, if you want. It could be changes in the hormones, etc. And so Hilke is leading a project where we're trying to look at changes at the biomarker level. So really fancy biology stuff to correlate with our changes. And then we have other projects related to that. But that's basically what I wanted to share with you, so you get an idea for one project that I did on this topic. And now I'm happy to answer questions if there are any.
Thank you, Pierre, so much. Before we get on to the questions, audience, please feel free to put in your questions in the chat. We will try our best to take them on as the speakers are talking, once the speakers are done. But if not, you can also keep them for the breakout rooms when you meet the speakers. But I'll get us started anyway. Thank you, Pierre. Two things that I take as an early career researcher from your presentation is that one, persistence pays off. You know, the paper took 10 years, was 10 years in the making, but then it had an excellent outcome. And two, if you pay attention, not attention, but, you know, if you put in a lot of effort collecting data, then hopefully that's set off against the review process, because your review process was only 4 months long instead of the 3-year-long review process that we are generally used to in the discipline. So that's great.
Yes, but I must also say that this is risky. I mean, 2 of the 3 reviewers recommended rejection because usually they say, hey, we don't know why it's happening.
Wow.
And there were, you know, and that's not a study that we're going to replicate, okay? Not me, for sure. You know, we've had enough headaches with it. Honestly, it was not so much fun because it took so long and it was so complicated. So in the end, right now, I forgot about the problems, but I think it's cautionary tale. Every field study, whether it's this one that involves patients or my other field studies that involve working with companies or etc., I find, to be honest, that it's a lot of work and the field is not always so open to them, maybe for good reasons. And so I think this is good to have in your portfolio of studies in the back burner, knowing that it's a high risk, maybe high reward, but high risk for sure. And but the one thing that I would say has been helpful really for me is to go beyond our business school audience. I mean, I think this reading in other disciplines, talking to people outside the field, that is always super illuminating, and we don't really do it. Okay, so I think it's something that I would really encourage just to become better researchers. I mean, we can start. Happy to answer questions about why it's different and what not, but certainly it was eye-opening for me to work with different people like that. Not always in a good way, okay? There are many people who just thought I was the devil because I'm a marketing professor and I'm basically paid by Coca-Cola. And you always constantly have to explain that, no, this is real research we're doing, and no, we're not paid by companies to do it.
So that ties in very nicely to my next question. You know, if we had to step back, as you said, talking to people in other disciplines is a source of, you know, good ideas in becoming a better researcher. What other sources of ideas do you have? Like, where do you get your research ideas from?
I think it's often what I see when you're starting in the field, a lot of your ideas come from you. You have this intuition, you've seen this with your kids, etc. I tend to look at what is a big problem, okay? Often, and so I decided I would focus on this topic of obesity because it's a big problem. It's not just in rich countries, it's everywhere. And it's something that, you know, there'll be many lifetimes worth of work on it. So that to me is a source of question, is something big, even if it's frustrating at times because you'll never be able to solve it, okay? And I see lots of really great questions here about, you know, why exactly, how about cultural differences, etc. One aspect, for example, that a question I get all the time from everyone who's not in marketing or psychology is the effect of social class that we never really study so much. And I thought it was interesting because in this paper, the people we studied had a very low level of education and all sorts of comorbidities associated with their illness, which really made the data collection very challenging. And so, but very interesting because they're not like our students who really grasp what you want, even if you don't explain it well. And so I think working with people who are, maybe migrants, people who are in fringe consumers in a way, is very challenging, but very interesting. And also talking with people in companies or in governments, I think helps us refocus on the big questions as opposed to being lost sometimes in our own little world of what we study.
And okay, last one from me before we jump on to audience questions. How do you balance this, this perception about marketing people just trying to shove products down consumers' throats, like, marketing professors just trying to sell more, just trying to, get people to consume more when we could all do with less consumption? How do you balance this being at a business school and trying to do good for the society?
I think it's an excellent question. I don't have the answer. I think on the one hand, I remember really well Bob Cialdini explaining that you can't really work with a company unless you've actually shown you care about their product. And he was talking about blood donation and how he had to give blood himself before they took him seriously. Wow. On the other hand, it means you're really embedded with the organization and you're biased, no question. And so in this field, constantly people are going to really disregard, or they will be skeptical about what you say, depending on who you are. And so one thing I am very careful now is not to get any funding money from even industry groups, not just a company, because otherwise you're tainted. And that's why, in a way, I'm happy I'm the L'Oreal chair and not the Coca-Cola chair, because otherwise, forget it, no one will take me seriously. So, but on the other hand, I believe that nothing is going to happen unless you actually engage the food industry, because they're the ones that are distributing and the food. So it's something that I always worry about. And people in nutrition, they laughed when I told them that I found it was hard, because they said it comes with the territory. You will have haters. There will be people on Twitter not so nice to you. It's normal. Deal with it. But it's not fun.
Yeah. Thank you. We will quickly take 2 audience questions for you. Dion, do you want to go ahead, unmute yourself and ask the question you have in mind?
Yeah, I was interested in the comorbidities, because that makes it complicated as well. But when you were talking about small, medium and large and mini and extra large, is there a cultural difference between in terms of how people respond to those sizes?
So I am right now actually working and trying to get anyone interested in replicating the paper with Jan Cornit, who was his dissertation, was actually also chosen as one of the papers in the ACR, where we have field studies with real paying customers in a restaurant, and somehow finding it really hard, because people say, okay, you already showed it with a few Turkers. And I'm like, what? I didn't know it would replicate. So how can you be so sure? But I think part of what we're trying to do now to make it more interesting is to look exactly like what you said, Diane, which is to look at cultural differences. And so we have studies, not exactly on mini, small, but on labeling in general, that show that French people are more likely to choose a smaller portion if you describe it as in a sensory way, I call it Epicurean way, than Americans. And I think it has to do with the food culture. It's not a coincidence that the English word for gourmet is gourmet, it's a French word. And I think the idea that focusing on quality and pleasure as opposed to quantity and nutrition, this is a cultural difference. And you're right that culture matters here, because this group of people who are studying there, they're not just physically different because they have inflammation of their fat tissues, that's the definition of obesity, but culturally as well, it's correlated with many other things. And it's impossible to disentangle both. It's a little bit, but no, actually it's impossible. They go together.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Dion, one final question from you.
No, I'll let everybody else talk. Thank you.
No, the other.
Oh,
Dion.
sorry.
There's another Dion.
No worries.
Yes, I was wondering if you looked at how much the effect related to the patients who go through the surgery having to learn about food choice, calories, just learning how to do that. Because from what I understand, after gastric bypass surgery, if they don't eat in a certain way, they can have some adverse effects. Thank you.
Yes, so everybody involved in the study had been trying to lose weight through other means before, because that's the procedure, and so they have been taught and taught again and again and again about calories and healthy choice, etc. So what is fascinating though is, from an anecdotal point of view, is I think more of a perceptual level. People who, because we have a task that is not in the paper, it's in the OSF file if anyone wants to look at the data, where we're looking at taste, the acuity of taste. So before surgery, they couldn't really taste sugar. They had to put a lot of sugar before tasting it. After that, their acuity was fantastic. And so this is not cognitive. It's really related to something else. And there's some theory that the composition, the diversity of the microbiome has something to is playing a role. And what really gastric surgery does is not just that it reduces the size of your stomach and that you can't eat more than 20 centiliters at a time. It's really that it changes the gut microbiota, which in itself then changes your preferences. Now, people who are obsessed with food become totally disinterested. It's really strange. It's not just a physical intervention. It's more than that. Now, of course, it's hard to disentangle what the surgery does, which is because there are many things that happen, obviously, also the way people look at you, etc. And so that's why in the follow-up paper, we're hoping to look at these biomarkers. The problem is there are literally hundreds of variables that we have data on. And 71 people in T0 and 40 at T1 year. And so it's we need a good theory to guide us, and we don't have it really right now. I'm just, to be honest, it's the next frontier. Maybe we'll have it later.
Thank you, Pierre. We will move on to our next speaker. I will share my screen back. And Gita, over to you to welcome Kate.
Thank you, Shilpa, and thank you, Pierre. That was so fascinating. I'm sure we could talk about it for another hour, but we have to move on in this session. So I'd like to welcome Kate now. And Kate, again, needs no introduction. She has had a long and prolific and sustained and impactful career working on issues to do with sustainability specifically, but pro-social consumption and generally consumer well-being. She is a leader in these areas in the scholarship, but also at UBC, where she is going to be running a conference soon on this topic. She's also Senior Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And she works with the Canadian government running large-scale experiments on these issues as well. So a common theme I think we'll see across the participants is that they collaborate with people in the field, and it's not just lab studies in these areas. So let me welcome Kate and turn it over to you. Kate will be sharing her paper today from 2013, published in the Journal of Marketing, When Do and Don't Normative Appeals Influence Sustainable Consumer Behaviors. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you, Gita. Thank you very much for inviting me today, and to Gita and to Shilpa for planning all of this. This is awesome. I'm just going to try to share my screen. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about kind of a different topic than Pierre. I'm going to be talking about encouraging sustainable behaviors. And I'm going to talk specifically about this paper here. So it's When Do and Don't Normative Messages Lead to Sustainable Consumer Behaviors. This is some work that I did when I was at the University of Calgary with Bonnie Simpson, who is now a professor, but she was at the time my PhD student. And I think my plan is to kind of talk a little bit through the process of idea generation and some of the I guess obstacles that we ran into as we were kind of going through the process of the study. In general, I just wanted to say that for me, when I think about generating research ideas, I think that overall I use these two strategies, each of them half the time. And so the first one is more of a deductive strategy where you have the bigger idea first. So you have like a broader theory, or you read something in a paper and you have this sort of bigger, higher overarching idea first. And then you kind of work from there. You kind of generate your hypothesis, and you test, and you go from there. The second one is more of an inductive approach where you see something in the real world. You notice something that you're doing, or like Pierre said, your kids are doing, or other people that you're watching. Maybe there's a piece of data or a phenomenon or something that you've observed. And then you're like, oh, why is that happening? And you kind of build up, and then you build the theory from there. I would say I use both of these a lot. But when it's these more better marketing for a better world type of topics, I would say I use the second one more. So for me, it's more common that there's some question or problem, something in real life that sort of sparks the interest. So that's often where my initial ideas come from in this space. And so the example I'm going to talk about is kind of an interesting one where the backstory is that the city of Calgary actually came to me with a problem in this case. And I had a relationship with them because I'd worked with them on another project on recycling. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to look at ways to decrease organic material going to the landfill. They didn't have at the time any kind of residential pickup service. So they didn't have like trucks that would come around and get your composting, or trucks that would come around and get your yard waste. But what they had noticed is that they were doing these waste composition studies, and they were noticing that a really large percentage of the waste going to the landfill was actually organic material. And I didn't know this at the time, but it's a problem when these organic materials go in the landfill. It's not the best. And at first I kind of thought, oh, well, it'll just decompose and it's just natural, it's all good. But if you put things in plastic bags that are organic, and then you cover it up in the landfill with a whole bunch of other stuff, the oxygen can't get to it. It can't decompose naturally. So it takes a really long time for things to decompose. And it also produces methane gas, which is a greenhouse gas. So there's all these bad things about there's lots of reasons to not put organic materials in the landfill. The other thing they noticed was that there were these two big spikes in terms of some of these materials going into the landfill. One of the big spikes in terms of like volume was actually right after the holidays. So people consuming a lot of food and other things, and it's just sort of this big explosion of materials going into the landfill. But the other one is actually end of spring, early summer, and it's yard waste. So it's sort of clippings of grass and things was the largest percentage of things going to the landfill. So what they wanted to do is figure out a way to communicate around a strategy or strategies to decrease some of these materials going to the landfill. And so they wanted to encourage this behavior called grass cycling, which it sounded weird at the time. It probably still sounds weird now. But the idea behind grass cycling is, maybe I'll say first, the current behavior or the existing behavior of people that lived in Calgary. So if you lived in like a suburb, you would probably have a large lawn. Everybody has a lawn. And the normal behavior is people will mow their lawn, they'll rake up the grass, they'll bag it up, and they'll bring it to the curb or the back of the house for pickup. And what the city wanted people to do, which is kind of interesting, is they wanted them to do a behavior that's less work. And usually when you're asking people to do something that's more sustainable, it's more work. So usually it either costs more, it takes more energy, or it takes more effort. But the city was actually asking people to do less work. So instead of raking up the grass, bagging it, carrying it somewhere else, and putting it out for collection, they wanted people to just sort of mow their lawn, let the grass clippings kind of decompose naturally, and then walk away, go have a break. And there's lots of benefits to this behavior. So it returns nutrients to the soil, it protects the soil, et cetera, et cetera. And so what the city of Calgary did is they had an informational campaign where they just told people about the behavior. Here's what it is, here's why it's great, here's why you should do it. They had flyers and they had television ads, and pretty much nobody would do this behavior in response to the informational campaign. And actually, I think that's a common, it's a common story I hear when you're trying to change these types of behaviors. Just giving people information only often isn't enough, right? Information alone might be part of it, but it's often not enough all by itself. And so what we ended up doing was we ran some focus groups, and we kind of asked people, what are the barriers for you? Why wouldn't you do this behavior? We're actually asking you to do less work. So what is the barrier and why won't you do this? And so what we found when we kind of did some of that initial digging and sort of investigating was there were kind of three things that people said. The first thing they said was, my neighbors aren't doing this behavior. Nobody else is doing this. And so actually what that is it's what researchers call a descriptive norm. And so a descriptive norm is a norm that indicates what other people are doing. And so the first thing people were saying was, nobody else is doing this super weird behavior. Why should I? The second thing people said was, what will my neighbors think? This isn't what they expect of me. This is really odd that you're asking me to do this behavior. And that's really more of an injunctive norm, which is sort of a social norm that reflects what we think others think I ought to do or what should be done. And then the last thing they said was, okay, what's in it for me? Why would I do this? What's the self-benefit for me? And so when we did this initial sort of looking at what people were saying, we realized we really had to do something with norms. It was very clear that we needed to do something with norms, and that was sort of the barrier for people. And so what we ended up doing as part of the study is, and I'm probably just going to go into detail of the field study that we ran, and we worked with the city of Calgary to create some different appeals, and we varied these things, the norms that we wanted to focus on. And so two things, I guess, that we had to think about. One of them was, maybe I'll just show this first. So this is an example of the descriptive norms we used. So we said things like, your neighbors are grass cycling, join others, and you can do this behavior too. So saying that other people are doing it. And we created these door hangers with the city, and they were on recycled paper, they were recyclable. One of the problems we ran into is that when you're communicating a descriptive norm, quite often what researchers do is they will say, 70% of people in your hotel room are hanging up their towels. So they'll say the percent of people that are doing the behavior. And so one of the things we ran into is that we didn't want to say the percent of people because it was a relatively low, some people were doing it, but it was a relatively low norm. So what we ended up doing is just kind of talking about people in general. So your neighbors are doing this without saying the actual norms. The other kind of obstacle we ran into was working with the people that helped us, the creative people that helped us create the door hangers. And they were wonderful and really good at what they did, but they didn't understand experimental design. So the idea is, obviously, we want to keep the images the same, the color the same, the font the same. We only want to change the messages on the door hangers. And it was hard for the creative people to get this around their head. So at first they had like 8 different colors, and each condition was a different color, and they had a different person on each one. And one of them they made on like seed paper so you could plant it after, which was super cool, but it's like you can't have that varying across experimental conditions. So one of the things I learned is you have to kind of educate who you're working with about what an experiment is and holding things constant. The other versions we had were an injunctive norm, which is more about what your neighbors want you to do. And then the other one was more of a self-benefit. So think about the self-benefits. The other part, we wanted to add something to this because just norms by themselves, there was already a lot of research on that. So we didn't want to just look at norms. And so I think we added a theory piece, which was the moderating role of whether the individual or the collective self is activated. I think this idea came to us just because we had other research where we had been interested in the individual and collective self. So it kind of just came together. So I don't know if there was an epiphany or or something we noticed, but it just kind of came from some other work we were doing. And so our idea is that we could use kind of priming or contextual cues to activate whether people are thinking more about the group, are they thinking more about the collective, or are they thinking more about the individual? And what we kind of proposed is this goal compatibility framework where we said, well, if we're activating the collective self, maybe some of these things like the norms, the descriptive injunctive norms might work quite well. Whereas if we're activating the individual self, we thought initially that the self-benefit would work really well. And I'll just show you what these look like. So on the other side of the door hanger and in some of our wording, for individual self, we said things like you as an individual, you can make a difference, versus collective self, which was more how can we as a community make a difference, and we can make a difference. I'm just going to talk through the method a little bit because this is where some other obstacles came up. And so it was a big planning exercise because we did this across a lot of households and we had to match, how we were going to collect this data over time and how we're going to match the households. So that was a big sort of endeavor. And what we did is we worked with the city employees and we monitored and collected data on people's grass cycling activities. And we wanted to do a pre-test and then a manipulation and then a post-test. And so the first thing we ran into was that we thought that we might be able to just look at people's yards and kind of go in like once a week maybe and either code what they were doing or maybe take photos of what they were doing. And it turns out that if you do this grass cycling behavior really well, it's hard to observe. So if you came like 2 days later and they did it really well and maybe it rained or something, you're just not going to be able to tell if they did it or not. And so we had to pivot in terms of what we were going to measure. And what we ended up doing is realizing that the garbage collectors are really good at knowing what's in the bags. And so we ended up having Bonnie, who was a PhD student and a research assistant, they drove behind the garbage collectors and the garbage collectors signaled to them how many bags of garbage total and how many are grass or yard waste. And Bonnie and the other RA told me it was kind of fun. I don't know if I 100% believe them, but they said it was okay. And it was really nice because the workers were really on board. They were very helpful. We slowed them down, right? So it took them more time, but they were wonderful about it. And we asked them what they wanted at the end, and they wanted beer. So we gave them the beer, and it was kind of a nice collaboration. So we did that for 3 weeks. And then we varied what versions of hangers different households got. So self-benefit versus descriptive versus injunctive, and that was crossed with the individual or collective self. We also had a no appeal group. So a group that got nothing, just to kind of see if behavior changed naturally over time. And then we went back again and we collected data on their activities again. So just sort of very quickly what we found. Sort of the main things we anticipated at this stage were, and actually looking at this graph, the lower numbers are better. So lower numbers on this graph mean that people decrease the amount of organics or yard waste that was going to the garbage over time. And so the ones that we kind of were expecting were the collective. So we being primed worked really well with descriptive norms and injunctive norms. And the individual benefit worked really well with the self-benefit messages. And then the one that we weren't 100% sure about was the individual self. When the individual self was activated, descriptive norms still worked pretty well. And we were kind of intrigued by that. And we kind of ran some more studies to explore that notion a little bit more. And very quickly, I'll just say we tested some moderators as well. I'm not going to get into those. What I wanted to say is the one study, we look at the moderating role of ambiguity, and that was something that was very much driven by the reviewers. So the reviewers were really interested in why did we see, so it's not immediately apparent why a descriptive norm, so what are other people doing, would work really well when the individual itself is primed. And so what we thought was going on was, well, this is a really unfamiliar behavior. I'm not really sure about it. And there's some research suggesting that descriptive norms are very informative in under these conditions, right? So if I'm not really sure about it, it's kind of uncertain. I might look to see what other people are doing. And so we ran some studies kind of looking at this idea of, well, when it's ambiguous, it's helpful to the self. And then that's when we might see this effect versus when it's not very ambiguous. And so that was really something that was driven by the review process. The reviewers really wanted us to do that. And so we ended up taking some of the initial studies out and putting that in. And so in my summary, I guess a couple of takeaways around the process. For me, at least for most of these types of studies, I would say it's more of that inductive approach where it's a real problem or there's some exploratory data at first. That's the source of ideas. And then combined with theory, still give it a little oomph. You have to sometimes be agile. So working with the staff who are creating the materials, or maybe switching up your DV if it doesn't work the way you thought it was going to work. And then sometimes following the data. So sometimes in field studies, you're like, why is that happening? And it might kind of lead you down a path to test some other theories or some other hypotheses. All right, that is it for me.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. That was really fascinating to also hear the backstory and hear a little bit more about the idea itself. And I reread the paper yesterday, just preparing for today. And this field study always blows me away, the way you did this. And the fact that, your Bonnie had to follow the truck for a few weeks in order to get the data. And I think Pierre also talked about the fact that Jan was really closely involved in the collection of the data. And both of you did these longitudinal studies where you really had to collect data over time. So that's pretty difficult to do. So these are just observations, but let me start by asking you a question about idea generation. And you said specifically in the BMBW domain, you pick up ideas by observation, like more of an inductive approach. And I found it really interesting that you used a focus group in this case. So you used kind of qualitative research, focus groups to try to understand what people are saying in terms of why they do or do not grass cycle, for example. And then the insights from the focus group led you to your theory and so on. So can you speak a little bit more about that process and the role of qualitative data in generating ideas?
Yeah, I find it immensely useful. And I think often when you're starting with an applied question or something you've observed, that kind of using some of these more qualitative techniques, and I've done this before, where it's like, what could be going on? And I mean, you could just run in and test a bunch of stuff, but I think it's a really nice way to start, just to kind of see what's coming to mind for people and what are they saying. And I've done it and you get kind of nothing, but I've also done it a couple of times and something very clearly comes out, and it's like, oh yeah, we have to do something on this. And when I talk about, sometimes I work with brands or with organizations who want to encourage sustainable behaviors, and I talk about the shift framework. One of the things I say at first is you need to take a little time at the beginning to really map out the behavior and the group or the audience that you're targeting, and really understand how those two things go together. And one really nice way to do that is to do some qualitative work, or maybe a survey at first, just to see. And it doesn't, I think there's times when people don't know why they're doing, like maybe they can't articulate what they're saying, but there are lots of times when they can articulate why they're doing something or why they're not doing something.
Yeah. Great. I think that your point is well taken, that sometimes we don't have access to why we do things, and the focus groups and the can take you so far, but also maybe observation or other kinds of maybe more ethnographic techniques can help in idea generation as well. Okay, so a second question I want to ask you is about partnerships with government specifically. And you partner with the Calgary government here, and it seems like even though it slowed down their trucks, for example, they were willing to go that extra mile and really partner with you. So what are some learnings you have from partnering with the government? How does one do that successfully?
Yeah, do you mean like starting, like initially, or during? Or both.
For our audience, even getting started would be great. And I know in Canada, maybe there's partly more openness to that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so even getting started, or once you've gotten started, some learnings that you've had.
Yeah. I think in terms of getting started, I've had good luck with just reaching out to partners and asking them if they're interested. And I think a lot of the time people think that research is cool and they want to be involved. So I think don't be afraid to reach out and ask people and ask for coffee and make connections. So I've had a lot of luck with it. And I think, I think people like research and it seems really neat. So that's kind of the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is there can be a lot of administrative red tape working with governments. So when Pierre was saying how long it took him to get that one study started, the first project I had with the city with Calgary was on residential recycling, and that took forever to get started. Like just the ethics at the university and also the legal at the city. Like it took so long, and we basically had to have the lawyers from the university and the lawyers of the city like sit down. So when we were doing the recycling study, they were saying things like, well, what if you're like looking in their recycling bins and you find evidence of illegal activity? And I'm like, really? What are we going to find? Guns in the recycling? Like, what's going to be there? And so the lawyers were arguing about it, and they had to like meet and just, come up with like a solution. And the solution was that they decided that as soon as the cart is moved by the resident to the curb, it's the property of the city. So the city can decide what happens once it hits the curb. It's the city's property. So just extra red tape and things taking more time than you might think. And then sometimes there's some kind of other deadline. So another thing with the city, when we did the recycling study, they had this huge campaign coming out. And so our goal was to run our study before this campaign came out, because we didn't want the campaign to influence the results, but we were like cutting it to the wire in terms of getting it. So I think it can take longer. And if I were, one piece of advice I give to grad students is maybe have one project or maybe one or two where you're working with a partner, but have something else too, because it could slow you down. If you only have projects with partners, you want to be able to run some other studies or have some other projects, just so that you don't it can take a lot of time. So
thank you, Kate. And time for just one question, and I'd like to ask Marsa from the audience if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question. Or I can just read the question out from the chat, Kate. So the question is, how did you find the obstacles and motivations? You mentioned about an interview, but what sort of technique or questions did you ask to explore the motivations?
Well, it was a long time ago. I think we just sort of asked a lot of open-ended questions. And for me, I often use the terminology, at least to myself, I often use the terminology of barriers and benefits. And so what that means is kind of asking people, like, imagine you were asked to do this behavior, what might stand in your way, right? What might be a barrier? Or, imagine you were asked to do this activity. Are there any benefits? Is there anything good? Like, is there anything you noticing that you're like, oh, maybe I would do this? So I don't remember the exact questions we asked because it was a really long time ago. And I think you can also use different techniques too. You can do, depending on what you're doing. I've done like sort of concept mapping before too, where you kind of see what, if you were doing something with a company or a brand and you wanted to see how people were reacting to it, see what kind of concepts get associated with it, that kind of thing can be very useful as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. I think we should move on to our last speaker today. And coming up now, we have Laura Peraccio. And Laura, again, also is someone who needs no introduction. As many of you know, she was a co-editor of the Journal of Consumer Research. She's been the president of the Society for Consumer Psychology and continues to take on so many leadership roles in our profession, but also do really fascinating, insightful consumer research. And lately, she's been leading the charge at TCR, the Transformative Consumer Research, to really share best practices on how to work with partners to create real impact on the ground. So in terms of translating theory to practice, I think Laura is really well positioned to share those insights with us. And today, Laura is going to talk about a paper that she's written with many others. You got a link to the paper when you registered. And the authors on this paper include academics, but also people in social impact organizations. And the paper is really about how to create these types of research partnerships. So let me turn it over to Laura Parachi.
Thank you so much, Gita. And I'm pulling up my presentation. Perfect. Thank you. So it's wonderful to be here with all of you today. And I am joining you from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, from my home. And this is my kitchen. In case you're wondering what is behind me, I have a giant poster of spaghetti in my kitchen. It's dedicated to my Italian heritage. Before we start, and I know this has been we've all been sitting here for an hour. If you want to put into the chat, and I'm going to ask you through my presentation to use the chat box, where are you? Where are you in the world right now? What city are you in, or what town are you in? And then what room in your house are you in right now? So I'm sitting in my kitchen. Where are you sitting? Just so we can share that with each other and know where we are. What I'm going to focus on today, as Gita said, I shared a paper that's part of my team, author team, and that's a TCR author team, Transformative Consumer Research author team. And I'm in this presentation, though, instead of sharing exactly what's in that paper, I'm going to talk about what I'll call my personal practices for doing this kind of research. So my personal best practices, and I have 3 of them, but I want to talk about how did I come up with this, with these practices? Where did they come from? And why did I, as I put them together, why these 3? I had a student ask me a question, and that student was asked me, I want to use my voice to help other people. What do I need to know to do that? And for all of us sitting here now, I know that we want to use our voice and our research to help other people. And the question is, how do we do that? How do we do that in ways that best fit maybe with our current research stream, with what we're doing, what we're thinking about, what's relevant and important in the world today? And as I thought about my students' question, I turned to some research that my team, and I know that Liz Miller, you are here today, who is part of this team. My team worked, I had an author team, and again, it was another TCR, Transformative Consumer Research author team, who worked on a project on youth change makers. And youth change makers are young people between the ages of about 15 and 25 who have started ventures or initiatives that have made significant impact in the world today. And this is I'm sharing, this is my favorite youth change maker, and I can say she's my favorite because this is my daughter. And this is what she has said and what she has written. You have ideas that can make an incredible impact on the world today, big or small. There will never be a perfect time. You will never have enough knowledge. If you have an idea, make it happen now. Take action, create change. So I say to all of you, and I know that's why we're all here today, we want to create positive change in the world. And what I want to share with you today are my 3 practices for things that have made a difference for me in terms of thinking about creating positive change. And the first one maybe is something that we as academics don't really talk much about, and that is cultivating well-being. And by that, I mean cultivating our own personal well-being. You put on your oxygen mask first before you put it onto the person sitting next to you, or your child sitting next to you. Create your team or teams. And I think that when we listen to Pierre and Kate talking, we can see that they have teams of people that they're working with. And we'll talk more about that. And then finally, connect with community. And again, you can see the first two presentations gave us incredible examples of connecting with community. And we'll talk about ways in which we can do that. First, cultivating well-being. And my thinking, and again, this is my practice, if I'm going to have a positive impact on anyone else, I need to start with myself. I need to start with a positive impact on myself. So what do I mean here? Things like eating right, exercising, getting enough sleep. I have 5 kids, so I have lots of advice in this area, from wearing a mask to wearing sunscreen to drinking enough water, whatever your practices are. And what I would say is that I have one vital practice, and that is sleep. Sleep is my superpower. So getting enough sleep is really important to me. And what I would invite you to do is think about this. What is your personal well-being practice that's really important to you? And I'm going to ask you again to share that in the chat so that others can see it. So if you think about your own personal well-being practice, something that you do or that maybe that you'd like to do, that's really key to cultivating your own well-being. And as we think about this, why is this important? We need to care for ourselves if we're going to have the energy to create impact in our lives. And to borrow from Maya Angelou wrote, develop enough courage, and I would say energy and motivation, so that you can stand up for yourself, and then you can stand up for somebody else. And with that, that moves us into this next idea of teams and working together. And I should say, I know that slide says create your team, but it's really teams with an S at the end of it, because we all have a lot of teams in our lives. My author, I have author teams for on my papers. I have my TCR colleagues who are my team. My colleagues at my university, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, they're part of my team. I have teams. My family is my team. My friends are my team. So we have a lot of teams that create support for us. But particularly when we're doing this kind of research, this kind of social impact research, where there are many roles and many, and we can see Pierre talked about the very long amount of time it takes to work on this kind of research. We want to have other people there who support us in the process, who are there as we work on those teams. So as we think about teams, one thing that I say all the time is that we is stronger than I. This idea of having multiple people working together. I have been working on research now for more than 30 years. That's an awfully long time. And how is it possible to sustain that? I would say it's sustainable because of my teams, because I really enjoy the people that I'm working with, my co-authors. And particularly with this kind of research, social impact research, it's not the kind of thing to go it alone on. It is something that really requires working together with other people. One of my co-authors, after we published a paper on social movements, sent me a poster that I have in my office, and it's a poster with a Margaret Mead quote on it. And so I'm going to read you that quote, and I'm sure it's one that many of us have heard before. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So now as you think about teams, if you want to share anything about your teams and the support of your teams, you can put that into the chat if you would like. If you have if you have team members on this call and you want to say thank you to them for working with you, that would be great. If you want to think about, if you have questions about teams and working with teams, also put it into the chat right now. So we have two practices then, cultivating well-being, create your team. And then the third practice is connecting with community. And I think both Pierre and Kate gave incredible examples of how to connect with community. And these are logos. On this slide, I have logos of some of the nonprofits that I've worked with and I'm currently working with. But I want to particularly focus on one nonprofit, and that is Hunger Task Force. And Hunger Task Force is a food bank and a food advocacy organization here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And what they do is supply all of the 90 food pantries, 60 plus senior food distribution sites, homeless shelters, schools, other places with food. And they also do a tremendous amount of food advocacy for food policy at both the national, state, and local levels. And when I think about Hunger Task Force, I want to tell a little bit of a story about how I got connected to them. As I said, I have 5 kids. And when my kids were little, we were looking for volunteer opportunities to things that would allow younger children to participate. Hunger Task Force had a number of those, but one of the things that really intrigued my kids was food collection. And they ran food collection drives, particularly collecting jars of peanut butter. So they collected jars of peanut butter, thousands of jars of peanut butter. And by doing that, by collecting all of those jars of peanut butter, over the years, we got connected to the Hunger Task Force, or I got connected to the Hunger Task Force. I did not anticipate when we started collecting jars of peanut butter 15 years ago, that would result in a whole series of research papers with the Hunger Task Force. And all of these papers are co-authored with the leadership members, various members of the leadership team at Hunger Task Force, and a lot of TCR researchers as well. So we have 3 published papers with the Hunger Task Force. We have 2 papers now under review, also with the Hunger Task Force. And we have a number of work in progress with them. And so, as you can see, it is possible then to develop a research stream working with nonprofits. In this case, we're working on issues of hunger and food access, and to do it in a way that creates research productivity. When we think about this, when we think about doing this, did I anticipate when we started collecting those jars of peanut butter that this would happen? Absolutely not. But we developed a relationship. I developed a relationship. My research team has developed a relationship with the Hunger Task Force over time. So one of the things I would encourage you to do is really think about the organizations and the things you care about in your everyday life. What are those? What organizations do you make gifts to, for instance, if you make charitable gifts? Or what organizations do you volunteer with? Do you have connections to? And are there ways that you can take what you really care about and work with those organizations on research? And I want to say very clearly that these kinds of research papers matter to these organizations. And it was really striking to me in working on the Stronger Together paper, the paper that you all received as part of this seminar, that many of the researchers doing this work, who are actually working with nonprofits, were unaware how important these papers are to these nonprofit organizations. I'll paraphrase. one of the executive directors of one of the organizations that we work with said, you cannot, there is no equivalent to being able to take a research paper and put it in front of a senator or a representative and say, here's evidence for the efficacy of this particular practice or program. It has a tremendous amount of influence and weight. So these kinds of research papers matter. What we are doing, the kinds of work we're doing really does matter and can make a difference. So I'd encourage you to think about what are the connections in your own life? What are the things that you care about? And if you want to, you can put that into the chat and think about what kinds of things you might look at and how that might even connect with what your research currently is. And so for me, these are my 3 personal practices on how to create impact: cultivating well-being, creating your team, connecting with community. And I would invite you to think about those and maybe think about what your own personal practices are as well. Thank you very much. And I always have to put in a plug for my Instagram. I post all kinds of books on change making and social change, if that is of interest to you. Thanks very much. Back to you, Gita.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was so inspiring. It was really amazing to hear from you and your very personalized take on this issue of how do we do research that makes a difference. I love that you had the 3 C's in there, like drawing on marketing. You had cultivate well-being, create teams, and connect with community. So that was really nice. And I think these will stay with me. So I want to maybe go back to the article we've read and ask you a question you kind of alluded to here, which is that this research matters because organizations you partner with can use our publications to get legitimacy in some sense, or to kind of use the research to go back to whether it's government or grant makers and really talk about why their program is working. So there is that kind of benefit of our publications to the organizations. But that's down the road, right? That's long term. The publications come after a process of collaboration. So can you speak to us a little bit? And I think you alluded to it's a long-term process, especially when you talked about with your kids getting volunteer opportunities and then building that relationship. But for our audience, like what are ways in which you can enable trust and create trust so that this relationship can start on a good footing? Eventually, yes, there'll be publications, but what does that entire process look like?
Mm-hmm. So I think Pierre talked about this, and I think Kate also addressed this issue of trust in the relationship. And I think part of this, it's really important that as you work with organizations and as you begin the process of working with them, that they know that what you're doing is not going to be extractive, but rather co-creative. And what do I mean by that? Extractive meaning the idea is that all you want to do as a researcher is take away some data from them. You just want their data and you're going to go off and you're going to do your research. It's not a partnership. What organizations are looking for, and the reason, look at what the Hunger Task Force, it's a whole stream of papers, it's because we are working together with them. And many of those ideas for papers came from conversations and relationships. So it's not that all our ideas or all Hunger Task Force's ideas, it's working together. We came up with even better ideas than we possibly could have on our own. So this idea of really working together helps to build trust. And also other ways that you can do it is start small. And I think this is important because sometimes there are organizations that you think you might want to work with, and I have had this experience too, but when in practice, it simply just doesn't work out for many reasons. So what I suggest doing is like come up with a pilot project. Don't decide, okay, I'm going to do, what Pierre did, a 10-year relationship. but rather something small that you can start with so that you can get to know the organization, make sure that that it's workable, that they're responsive, they can know that you're responsive too. So some sort of pilot project is a really great idea to get started at the very beginning. And some of the things you can, even inviting people into your classroom, maybe working on a student project together as a way to start to develop a relationship, or a small project, or maybe it's you're going to go out and volunteer. I can tell you that one of the things that's really helped me to better understand food access was the Hunger Task Force has a mobile market, which goes into the food deserts in Milwaukee. There are many food deserts in Milwaukee, which are areas where there are no grocery stores to buy fresh fruits and vegetables. And I volunteered on that mobile market, helping people who were shopping for their groceries, shopping for fresh fruits and vegetables. And doing that really helped me to understand the problem of food access, who the people were, and what they were talking about. And again, one of the real values of working with nonprofits is this idea of really getting an understanding at the very much the grassroots level. What are the problems that we're working on and trying to solve? And once we can see those problems firsthand, that may really help us to develop a deeper understanding of them. I think that's a long answer to your question, Gita.
No, that's a great answer. I picked out 3 things I thought were really important in what you just said. The first was like sometimes the ideas, you have to open yourself to getting ideas from the organization, from your partners, and not think you have the sole right to come up with the ideas. You're not solving for their problem, you're solving together, you're co-creating solutions to problems. The second thing you said, I think is really interesting, is start with pilots and start small. I think that makes a lot of sense, especially for the students in our audience and people who, really want to get research off the ground fairly quickly. Maybe start with small pilots. I also like that you said use your students from your classrooms, maybe do partnerships through your teaching activities. Our teaching and research don't always have to be separate. We could have our students in our classrooms get involved in projects and learn from those projects as well. And I think those were some of the key things that you mentioned about building the trust and having these long-term relationships. You did talk a lot about volunteering and ethnography, almost learning on the ground. Again, as I said to Kate, like you said, you volunteered with the mobile, food carts and learned a lot about the people who actually use the service. So it's almost like immersing yourself into this problem as well. So those were really, really interesting. I want to end with just asking you a question about your favorite paper in the general topic of responsible consumption. What's something that you keep finding yourself drawn to and that you really like?
So I have a lot of favorites, and I think I highlighted some of those. There's a paper in the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing that we published called Hunger and Food Wellbeing, which was jointly published with the Hunger Task Force. And that paper, I think it really had an impact, and in citations certainly, but it had an impact in the real world, because what the Hunger Task Force was able to do was use that paper as part of their presentation in order to get more funding for their mobile market. So they know that paper was key in helping them essentially double their funding, so that now they have 2 mobile markets, and they've got one that goes out in more in southern areas of Wisconsin, and one here in the Milwaukee area. So that really had, certainly it's conceptually has a lot of interesting ideas about how to deliver food well-being to people who are experiencing hunger. But it also had this practical impact of really helping people here in my area in Milwaukee get access to food. And I think that is a good feeling to have. And so I hope that all of you, as you think about doing research, think about the great possibilities that we all have in making an impact.